NACDL is the association of the nation's criminal defense bar.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this year's State Criminal Justice Network Conference. If you're just joining for the first time, I'll say welcome. And if you have been with us for any of the previous sessions, I'll say welcome back. So we're really excited. We are sort of at day 2 in the last panel that we are wrapping up this year's conference. And really, this panel is going to be discussing sort of effective messaging to advance criminal legal reform. And I'm really excited for this panel. If you joined us for the previous one on drug decriminalization in Oregon, we heard one of our panelists, Morgan, say a statement that I think is really transitions well into this panel's topic. And she said, "Why do facts fall short?" And she was discussing it in the realm of efforts in Oregon around decriminalizing drugs, but also, efforts of trying to recriminalize drugs as well. And she made that statement in terms of why do facts fall short. And I think it's a really good transition into what we want to talk about for this panel. So our moderating for today's panel discussion is going to be Rabia Burks. She serves as Vice President of Communications and Team Building for the National Legal Aid and Defender Association, NLADA. So Rabia, I will turn it over to you.
Awesome. Thank you for having me. Thank you for having us. This panel, it should be very much exciting for a lot of people. Communications in general in the criminal legal space, we have a lot of room for growth. And I feel like this is one of the most innovative ways we can change and impact advocacy in terms of in criminal legal system, including tough on crime narratives and everything else, which is like the next phase, I think, and a lot of the work that a lot of us have to do. And I know that everyone here, all the panelists that I'm about to introduce right now, they all have a vested interest and want to help all of us collectively increase and change the narrative around tough on crime, as well as any other criminal legal issues that impact policies that impact folks from day to day. So I'm going to go through and introduce everybody. So we have Intra Ramani, who is the Vice President of Advocacy and Partnerships for the Vera Institute for Justice. Hannah Riley, the Director of Programming at the Center for Just Journalism, and Scott Heckinger, Executive Director and Founder of Zealous. So what we want to do first, the very first thing we want to do, and we thought this was very important when we were having our discussions, is to have a discussion of how we got here. When we talk about tough on crime narratives, what are we talking about? You hear that as a buzz term. You hear people talking about, how do we change this narrative? But what are we fighting against? What is an actual tough on crime narrative, and where did it come from?
Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison.
It's like a baseball player. A lot of times you're going to do an ad and you strike out. Nobody even cares about it. It's rare that you have one where you swing and you hit and you just watch it sail.
My assistant called me up and said they caught Willie Horton. And I said, well, what do you mean they caught him? He's been in prison for life. Why are murderers being let out into the streets? We learned fairly quickly that he was out on a weekend pass, a furlough they called it, and he invaded a couple's house in Maryland, brutalized the man and raped the woman.
Dukakis believed the furlough policy would encourage better behavior in prison by lifers. They need some kind of incentive, or there will be, chaos inside. It was a big story in the local papers. So the minute we had the nomination, we knew we were going to face Willie Horton.
Bush and Dukakis on crime. Bush supports the death penalty for first-degree murderers. Dukakis not only opposes the death penalty, he allowed first-degree murderers to have weekend passes from prison. One was Willie Horton.
I ran an independent expenditure, which is an outside organization that isn't involved with the actual campaign. We were scared Governor Dukakis, who was running rather large leads in the polls, was going to sweep to victory. So it called for some dramatic campaign action.
Despite a life sentence, Horton received 10 weekend passes from prison. Horton fled, kidnapped a young couple, stabbing the man and repeatedly raping his girlfriend.
The impact and the effect, I believe, had a great deal to do with Willie Horton's race.
Horton was an ugly guy, and he looked like everybody's stereotype of a black thug. I can't believe when they made those ads, they didn't know what they were doing, raising racial fears.
Willie Horton was a hardened criminal. People are rightly scared. It doesn't matter if he's black or white or yellow or purple.
But what ultimately killed Dukakis was not the Willie Horton ad, it was the Poly Pavilion answer.
Governor, if Kitty Dukakis were raped and murdered, would you favor an irrevocable death penalty for the killer?
That was as close as we were going to ever get to the Willie Horton question. We must have done the answer 1,000 times. I know what it's like to be the victim of crime. I'm on the side of victims.
No, I don't, Bernard, and I think you know that I've opposed the death penalty during all of my life. I don't see any evidence that it's a deterrent. And
it came right across the plate, and he didn't see it. It was very clear after that first question we were going to go into free fall.
It was probably the first of the great independent expenditures. We didn't have any involvement with the Bush campaign. We had a commonality of interest to continue the Reagan Revolution, and the ad impacted public policy. All across the country, I'll always be glad I did it.
That campaign made clear that the best way to destroy someone was to find an outside group to do the kind of ad that the candidate himself can't do because he'll get killed for doing it, such as Swift boat veterans, for instance.
When the chips were down, you could not count on John Kerry.
John Kerry is no war hero.
Now it's become just a usual tactic. In the wake of that race, every Democratic politician I knew was tripping over themselves to vote for 3 strikes laws, mandatory sentencing, anything they could vote for to prove they were tough on crime. What Willie Horton did was create a generation of legislators who voted for everything. And the result was crowded prisons, suspicion in the minority community, tensions that continue to this day.
In a way, I tie this to the state of America today. This was somehow when we started beating the heck out of each other for totally political purposes. This ad, I think, hit at the inner fears of people, and it's just escalated over the last, 28 years?
So the reason why we wanted to start off and open up this panel discussion with that ad is because we have to remember how we got here. Tough on crime, the Willie Horton narrative, the Willie Horton ad is one of the most famous ads that started the push for the tough on crime movement in politics in general. So when we talk about tough on crime, a lot of times we're not talking about just simply the idea that law enforcement or someone else is pushing for over incarceration, right? It's more than that. It is a literal political tactic to influence to get elected. For the most part, it's about campaigns. It's not necessarily about truth or any of those things or data or any of that. A lot of times when we're talking about fighting against tough on crime narratives, we are talking about fighting against a political campaign to get people elected. And that's just a very small way of explaining it. But sometimes when we talk about tough on crime narratives, we think of it as this amorphous thing, and we want to bring it to you guys in sort of a kind of understand what we are attacking. We're attacking people's the ads are used, or not just ads, but the tough on crime narrative is used to instill fear, to make sure that people vote for certain people who are pushing tough, who are communicating public safety ideology, if that makes sense. I wanted to turn to Incha and ask, how does some of this compare to today?
Hi, everybody. It's great to be here. So we saw Willie Horton, that was 1988, to just put a timestamp on it. And then we saw what came after the 1994 crime bill. Mass incarceration was already in place by the early 1990s, but we saw it increase exponentially throughout the 1990s and into the 2000s. And what we've seen is, in general, politicians throughout that time stayed away from issues of justice reform. If they would say anything about crime, it was how tough on crime I am. But something changed, and I would actually say how I feel in this moment is more hopeful that we can win back the narrative around safety, accountability, and justice, because we are sitting here today in 2023 after several seismic moments in this country's history, most notably 2020, and the uprisings and protests that we saw in the summer after George Floyd and so many others' murders. And mind you, that's been growing throughout the last 15 years and before, and there's always been momentum at the local level. We've seen progress at the local level, but we have a different national conversation now about what it means to be safe, what it means to have a system that's accountable, what personal accountability means, that it's not more punishment necessarily, and what justice looks like too. And so I'm excited to get into some specific examples, but I do want to say, I think we are not still in the Willie Horton moment. And the Willie Horton attacks, and we see them every day, but they're only potent if they've been left unmet. And we have many more ways to meet the attacks and actually overcome them.
Absolutely. Hannah, can you talk a little bit about how the media has played into tough on crime narratives historically? I know we just saw the Willie Horton ad, and that's just the beginning of it. And so I just wanted people to just have a idea of where we came from and how we got here. But literally nuts and bolts, how has the media played into the current tough on crime narratives?
So I tend to say that media and the criminal punishment system are two systems who have been propping each other up basically since the inception of both of them. Gosh, there are a million examples of media concocted crime waves that I could talk about. And I'm sorry if someone on here has heard me speak before, because I use this example all the time, but it's such a good one. There's a really comprehensive report out of Cleveland, Ohio, I think in 1919, that delves into sort of like a post-mortem of a media-created crime panic. They discuss how it's a month-long period. The first 2 weeks of the month, I think there were, 360 felonies. And then the second 2 weeks, there were 384. So a statistically really insignificant difference. This is at a time when we literally measured coverage by the number of inches that it got in the paper. They discuss how these first 2 weeks, there was, 900 inches dedicated to these crimes. And then the second half of the month, it basically doubled. And I'm realizing in retrospect, I should have sent this out so you could all see it, but here we are. Again, this is more than a century ago. This was sort of the post-mortem after this had happened. It had been somewhat inadvertent. And of course, the result was that every single jail cell in this county was filled. People were sleeping on the streets. So here's how they summarize it. An unusual amount of space and special headline emphasis are given to crimes indiscriminately, whether great or small. There's little or no attempt to give dependable statistics of the actual increase in crime, and still less to analyze causes and underlying conditions. This results in a tendency to demand summary action and quickly reportable results on the part of police, prosecutors, and judges. Again, I could read forever from this report, but it could have been written yesterday. There was coverage about bail. There was coverage about, the unique, strange nature of these last 2 weeks without any kind of look at the actual data, which again would have showed that it was not a statistically significant difference. This is one example. Again, I there are so many. One of the first things they teach you in criminology school, and this could be wrong, but is that very, very few crime waves have actually occurred. They often are simply concocted by media. That's not always intentional. I know that media, obviously, they have a bottom line. They want to respond to things that they are hearing from their own readers. So, it's not, I don't mean to intend nefarious intent in all of these things, but yeah, I don't think it's hyperbolic to say that since both of these institutions have existed, they have propped each other up in ways that actually don't have much public good. And I know that those are what both systems intend to get to in the very end. So yeah, I could talk about this forever, but media and law have propped each other up in pretty negative ways forever.
But with all of that, there's hope. And what has happened, and I know all of us on this panel have gotten this question over and over again: how do we combat these tough on crime narratives? How do we stop the bleeding? Every time there's, every 4 years, because every election season, it comes up again. And then reformers and people who are in the advocacy space are concerned about passing bills. They're concerned about lawmakers turning against the bills that they were once favorable of and everything else. But there's something that changed significantly in the 2000s and so was the advent of the internet, number one, our ability to message directly to people. So that marriage between the newspaper and the media and the police or whoever else you feel are pushing these narratives, there's a third wheel. We're able to get our messages out in a different way. And so I think it's important to say that, because we are not where we were when when the crime bill was being passed. So all of the fears that we all have in general of like, oh, let's be more conservative on our talking points as it relates to tough on crime narratives may not apply anymore. And I want to pass it to Insha to talk about where we are messaging wise, which I think her work is so fascinating. So I'm gonna turn it to you.
Thanks so much, Rabia. And y'all are going to have to humor me in some slides for a couple of minutes, but I hope they are helpful. So let me actually share my screen and put this up, and we can absolutely share this. And there is many more slides where this came from. So more than happy to dig into details as well. But I want to keep this short so folks just get a sense of how do we do exactly what we are here to talk about, which is win the narrative on safety, accountability, and justice. And the Willie Horton ad, the reason it was effective is because it tapped into a fundamental emotion, which is being scared. It's fear, right? And that is what drives so much of these narratives around crime and who is considered a criminal and safety. And what we started to do at Vera Action, which is Vera's 501c4 a year ago, is actually dig in and ask questions about what do voters, communities, what do we need to hear about safety, accountability, and justice, and what messages resonate to inoculate against the tough on crime attacks. And what we found is that fear is a motivating emotion for people only if it's left unmet. And what you can meet it with are actual solutions. And so what we found is leading with solutions and not giving into the scare tactics is what works. And so I said before, after 1988, what we saw again and again and again in the political sphere were politicians voting to be more tough on crime. And that was true across political parties, Republicans and Democrats and everybody in between. But like I said, I also have optimism. And part of the reason is the Chicago mayoral race this year. For those of you who were following it closely, Brandon Johnson won. Johnson won running as a Black man who grew up in Chicago, who knows what it is like to be a victim of crime and violence. He won running on a platform saying, we have solutions that actually make us safe. We need to take a new holistic approach to what it means to make communities safe, and I reject the tough on crime policies. His opponent was a police union endorsed white man running a more tough on crime campaign than you have seen from any Democrat in recent election cycles. And it turns out that Brandon Johnson won. And the question really is, how did he win? what did he win on when it comes to issues of crime and safety, and what can we learn from this? And I found it fascinating to see that the New York Times, the day after Brandon Johnson's victory, they finally looked to him and said, oh, the way that he is talking about crime might actually be a blueprint for how we can win. Substitute Democrats for progressives, those of us who care about justice, put whatever you want in there, but in fact, there's something to be learned there. And so let me go through some of the research that we have found on this and what actually creates a winning message. And like I said, the conventional wisdom is that scare tactics are effective. And what we have seen most politicians do when they are attacked for being soft on crime is they do one of two things. They either pivot from the issue and duck and start talking about something that they think is more favorable. They're leaving that tough on crime attack hanging. Or they double down on their own version of tough on crime. So, no, I don't want to defund the police. I'll fund the police even more. No, I'm not soft on crime. I actually believe in putting violent criminals behind bars. You just hear it constantly. The problem with that is that you then sound like your opposition. And the truth is, when we did research, and we've seen this in every national and local poll, is voters and communities don't think either party, Republicans or Democrats, are doing well on issues of crime and safety. The Republicans have a slight advantage. That advantage is because they talk about the issue of crime more, and scare tactics actually doesn't work to win over voters because they're not talking about what voters want, which is solutions. And so what we did, and this is after the midterm election cycle, and we know $157 million was spent across the country on soft on crime attacks, calling Democrats out for being soft on crime. And we did a national survey oversampling in 7 battleground states where the issue of crime came up the most. So Wisconsin and Mandela Barnes race, John Fetterman and the Pennsylvania race. And we asked respondents, actual voters, which of these statements do you agree with more? And what we have on the left-hand side is your typical soft on crime attack of Democrats' pro-criminal, anti-police agendas created prosecutors who'd rather let a dangerous criminal walk out of jail than enforce the law. They want to eliminate cash bail, leading to a revolving door. They don't want to support the police. And basically, they've created chaos. We need to vote them out to keep us safe. We've all heard that attack, right? What we did then was compare it to 2 other messages. One was an actual campaign ad that ran in New York. Too little, too late, frankly. But here's what it was. It was a solutions-oriented message that talked about all the right things when it comes to solutions to keep communities safe. And it starts with safe walk home at night, bus ride free of fear, a safer state for every child. That's what I'm working for. I want to pass a comprehensive crime plan to make it happen. We'll go after illegal guns to make our neighborhoods safer, increase street lighting, partner with law enforcement to build trust with the community, get help for the homeless, those suffering with mental illness. You deserve to feel safe. I won't stop working until you do. That's the kind of message that Brandon Johnson led with, ran on, repeated time and time again. We then tested another message, which is what we often see when politicians are attacked for being soft on crime, what they respond with, which is their own version of tough on crime. And they say, too many in my party think it's okay not to talk about the growing violent crime problem. They only focus on defunding the police. We need to get more police in. There's less than 5 members in the US House who are for defunding the police. They're extreme and aren't listening to voters, but the rest of us are. We'll add 100,000 more police on the ground. Mind you, that's what we heard a lot of Democrats say last election cycle. Turns out, if you just respond to the attack, you actually win out, you inoculate against a soft on crime attack. But look at the numbers. If you actually get off their narrative frame and get onto your own about what solutions work, you outperform the I too am tough on crime attack. And we've tested this both nationally and locally, and it works. So there's 3 lessons to take from this about how we message on safety, accountability, and justice. One is don't be silent. Part of the problem with the Michael Dukakis answer was that was the only answer he gave, and it wasn't a great answer, but at least he gave an answer. But you didn't hear that time and time again. That Willie Horton ad was everywhere. Communities want to hear from politicians about their solutions for safety, accountability, and justice. This is especially true among Black communities, Black voters. Black voters are more likely than anybody else by a margin of 2 to 1 to say, I am worried about crime in my community, in my neighborhood where I live, not just in general over there, meaning the dog whistle of the big city. And the assumption is if voters say they're concerned about crime, they favor tough on crime policies. Not true. So again, national survey, we asked, When you, in an approach to addressing crime, would you choose a tough on crime approach or crime prevention? Across all voters, including moderates, independents, and conservatives, 53 to 47% said crime prevention. Take out Black voters, 64 to 36. Young voters, 57 to 43, and so on. So you can actually see if you lead with talking about preventing crime before it happens, not just reacting after, which is our tough on crime status quo, you can win on this narrative. Policing is where this gets especially tricky, and we saw in the last election cycle a race to outdo each other on being more like funding for the police. Turns out that's actually not what voters and communities want. What they want to know is that police are supported to do the difficult jobs they're tasked to do. They want better and more accountable policing, not more policing. And very much so, they support police reform and accountability. So we tested out a defund message and what's the right inoculation. You can see the defund attack. It's your standard thing you've heard. Here's the right answer that actually gets you out from the, no, I too want to fund the police, or I'm not for defund, but, or I am for defund. You're still talking about police and funding. That's not what people want to hear about. What they want to hear about is safety. So what you say is, not about scare tactics or slogans. I'm not afraid to have an honest conversation. We keep expecting police to solve every social problem, from kids skipping school to mental illness to homelessness to gun violence. No one profession can do that. You're spending $115 billion a year and putting too much on police departments. It's time to try out some promising new solutions to lift the burden. It's time for support and change, not blame. From there, you can go right to civilian crisis first response, sending the right responder that's not police, etc. Outperforms the defund attack by 16 percentage points. We tried this another way. We asked, when it comes to the police, what would you want to hear from elected leaders? By 20 percentage points, they said, support them and hold them accountable if they abuse their power or break the law, over support for funding the police or wanting to put 100,000 more police on the ground. What this tells us is that the political conversation around policing and funding or defunding is not actually responding to what our communities want when we talk about safety, which is we want to make sure that we have first responders who are addressing our issues, our needs for safety. Unless you think that this is like, well, that might work in New York or California, but how is this message going to hold up in Texas or Ohio or Michigan or anywhere else? Turns out the solutions message performs well across the political spectrum, across geographic differences. So we tried this out. Democratic narrative, Republican narrative, i.e. solutions narrative versus scare tactics narrative, holds up across the Northeast, Midwest, South and West, cities, suburbs, towns. It barely is underwater in rural areas, but that's not a problem with the narrative. It's just it hasn't been said and heard enough to actually take hold. So I'll stop there. Again, there's much more to this, but I think it's really helpful to have a sense of like, what is the frame and what can we say about the most sort of like challenging issues where we've watched our elected leaders really get this wrong.
Thank you so much for that. I think one of the things, the big thing that, I took from that is that, it's been 30 years. It's been 30 years. We've tried throwing the book at everybody. We've tried all of these things and we've seen the fallout of that. And everybody has seen the fallout of that. We've saw all of the negative things that come with over incarceration, mass incarceration. People are not unaware of these things. So people are looking for solutions. And that's where we as a community have a real opportunity to take hold of what has, it's the same tired narrative and switch that narrative around in favor of things that actually will work. I want to turn to Scott and ask Scott, because he works really closely with defenders who are really close in proximity to the problems and the issues, to amplify their messages, to be able to change and affect policy and change the narrative. And I would like for you to go a little bit deep and talk to us about your work in storytelling and how you've worked to try to change the narrative.
Yeah, I appreciate being here, and it's always an honor and also terrifying to follow Insha, because it's like she brings the numbers and it's like, I hope what I'm about to say is consistent. Good news is it usually is. We tend to agree. I want to talk about, just the power of storytelling and its impact on messaging, narrative change, and advocacy kind of more broadly. And obviously it's based upon my experience working with defenders, but other advocates. And I think a good place to start is identifying what the other side is doing really effectively. Like the things that frustrated me so much when I was practicing as a public defender for close to a decade, and then seeing and hearing the narratives and the news outside of court and knowing how different things were from the lies that were being told and, more importantly, believed. So we've seen the power of storytelling. That's what we've been talking about. Mostly lies over the last half century, told expertly by police and prosecutors and aligned interest, intended, as Insha described, to spark the strongest of human emotions, fear, that drives this fight or flight response that's led us to our current moment of continued public support for policies that are costly and don't achieve health and safety, despite, for the first time, and this is a real exciting moment, having real data on our side about the success of changes that we're able to pass because of political courage, because of some of the shifts that we've seen, but data is no match. When I think of advocacy storytelling and narrative change, it's not just compelling stories. We also have to think about the importance of narrative alignment and collaborative strategy. So it turns out that there is remarkable alignment and messaging discipline on top of major budgets from police and prosecutors and aligned interests. On our side, movement for health and safety, defenders, organizers, advocates, historically, we're not that aligned. Unfortunately, we as a movement, we tend to operate in silos. We tend not to trust one another, local to local, local to national, national org to national org. And we let disagreements, often very valid, stand in the way of broader coalition on the 80% we do agree with. So I see a strong affirmative message about safety, accountability, responsibility, health being truly dependent on us working better together. That's a key part of storytelling. Agreeing on a language blueprint, broader strategy, values, and principles, at least agreeing not to endorse things or talk about issues in a way that's going to wind up reinforcing the very status quo we're trying to transform. And when it comes to the actual stories, the narratives, I think we have to, and this is really in line, glad to say, with Insha's findings, I think we have to broadly expand the types of stories that we tell. Although we as a movement, we as defenders have access to a great richness of stories, to the extent that we do speak up as a movement, we tend to fight fire or try to fight fire with fire. So we've tended historically to focus on countering the sensational stories of violence, the Willie Horton stories and the extreme, with sensational stories of injustice. Stories that we need to tell, jail deaths, exonerations after decades, stories of innocence. Or we tend to fight fire with stories of sensational success. So someone released early and goes on to start a business, graduate from college or teach at law school. Again, these are stories we need to tell, but only telling those stories inures the general public to what's in the middle. Everyday injustices we see en masse, but also stories of freedom, abundance, community solutions, innovations, the future now, right? And this is key, I think. That's why I think a lot of work right now as a movement, when we think about powerful stories we can be telling, and the most powerful stories that are being told, they really should be focused on freedom, on the future, on showing rather than telling, on breaking through this sense that the quote absence of pretrial incarceration, policing, lengthy sentences, horrible jail conditions comes with lawlessness, and the future that we're asking for is just fictional, idealistic utopia. We actually have thousands of examples of what different looks like throughout the country. And we need to start, I think, flooding the market with those stories. Like bail looks like normalcy. People waking up on their own beds, tying their own shoes, being with their families, running errands for immunocompromised loved ones. Alternatives to the current status quo look like food security, affordable housing, jobs, solar innovations, violence interruption, restorative justice, things that exist. So those are the stories I think we need to be telling. And yeah, I'll stop there.
Great, Scott. Hannah, can you talk a little bit about getting the message out there, about how do we begin to actually do this? Like, how do we start changing the narrative?
Oh, just that small question. Okay, my answer is not very sexy. And it is coming from the perspective that at the Center for Just Journalism, we quite literally are here to be a resource to journalists who are covering these systems. I assume that most of the people I'm talking to today are lawyers, so you all understand that this is incredibly confusing and opaque, and like, imagine trying to cover this in just your own city, let alone, you know, a state, national. It's a really, really hard job to have. So I see a lot of the work that I do at CJJ as like organizing work functionally. It starts with making real relationships with reporters who are doing this work in your area. I come from the stance that I know all of this stuff and they probably know 10% of this, and I only know it because I'm steeped in this and I have been for, you know, a decade and a half. A little conversation, you know, I'm going to give an example of a reporter that I met with recently who covers, you know, crime and courts and also obits and also like climate change, and, you know, already has far too much being asked of them. And they're kind of desperate for help. And in just a couple of initial conversations, you know, where we were able, it isn't feeling like I'm coming in and I'm wagging my finger about like their word choice or their framing choice. And instead, it's generative. So, you know, Scott talked about the work with PDs. I think, as we all know, folks doing public defense in these localities tend to have an ear to the ground. They have a much better sense of safety issues than a lot of reporters who are being asked to cover these things. So some conversations that can help sort of broaden how they think about these things, to saying, okay, you know, from my perspective, we have this really, really narrow look at public safety issues just through things that are tracked by police, and then also issues that are dealt with by police and prosecutors within the criminal legal system. And that's really, really narrow, right? I think everyone here understands that this is a Band-Aid, and that there are many, many other issues that impact public safety to the same extent or more than things like index crimes. So starting to have conversations with folks in your localities where you're connecting journalists and public defenders and organizers and policy wonks, and, you know, truly just doing the human relationship first, because, and I could spend, you know, 25 minutes talking about sourcing. I won't, another very unsexy topic, but the matter is, it really, 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 really impacts a story depending on who that first source is. So if there's a journalist who's had good conversations with folks who are outside of the orbit of, you know, the DA and the, you know, the sheriff's office, what are the odds that they are going to go to a public defender first and say like, hey, I've been asked to write the story on carjacking, you know, can you give me a sense of what you've seen on the ground? You know, does your office think that the numbers that are coming from the sheriff's office seem right? Just not antagonistic, like a way to show that this is collaborative work. I wish it didn't have to be collaborative, but I think we all know that media as an industry is on life support a little bit. So, you know, helping to point out when you use a quote, let's say from a sheriff without much context or without any fact checking, you know, a way to walk them through and say, when you give this quote, and it seems like this very narrow thing is the only way to remedy this, then it's doing a huge disservice to the public, to policymakers who might have different ideas, et cetera. So yeah, that's a long and rambling way of saying, unfortunately, part of this has to be relationships with reporters. I cannot underscore everything that has felt like a meaningful shift in narrative in my work has been the result of a reporter who I know well on a personal level, who I've put the effort into knowing well, and who I've made the effort to say, like, I'm actually just here to make your job easier, because my God, it is really, really hard to cover these issues without a law degree or even with a law degree. So yeah, I really encourage folks to just start these relationships. It sounds simple, but I feel pretty strongly that that's where the most significant change comes from.
Yeah, and I just want to throw out there, and I just want everybody to realize you as for most of my career, what I have focused on is really getting organizations to tell their own stories, to use social media, to use their websites, to get on TikTok. I know that sounds random, and I know a lot of people, but this is where the conversations are happening. It used to be a time where you only had a journalist to tell your story. Now you have the power in your own hands to build your own audiences, to do all of these different things. And I think that I would like for everybody not to discount the power of telling your own stories. I have, through FAM Foundation and NLADA and just different, I've been able to change coverage by making sure that our social media profiles or making sure that our messaging is out there that is counter and narrative to what it's saying. And people are forced to literally call us, contact us, get to know different people because of the outside pressure to say, oh, well, this group has something to say and we have to now talk to them because clearly they're driving conversations in a way that is not so one-on-one, or someone who has a relationship with a reporter and all that stuff, which I think is important. But you have the power also to advance your own stories. We have questions and everything else. There's so much to talk about, but I did want to ask real quickly, how do we win? You know, how do we win this? And we do have questions. So Scott, can you go ahead with how do we win this?
Well, I'll try to keep this short because we have questions. I mean, there's so much to talk about, but just focusing on defenders and building off what you just talked about. I think we as public defenders need to get, and this is a lot of what I do, kind of dispel myths, more comfortable with speaking out. We have so much perspective and expertise. We have unique relationships with the folks who we represent. We are strategic storytellers already, and we hate losing. We need to speak up. But I think one of the reasons why, I know one of the reasons why people don't, or why public defenders don't, is because there's a perception, if you go on TikTok or Twitter, public defenders are supposed to talk just about that individual case with a case open. They think about the most kind of extreme case. The reality is what we talk with defenders about is the power of both memoir, so talking about your own experience as a practitioner, what you see and sharing your perspective and expertise, and also the power of aggregate storytelling. As a public defender, I see en masse every day X, Y, and Z patterns. So that's like one thing just to kind of think about. The other thing that Hannah just mentioned is about the way that we interact with the press. There's this no comment culture because we're concerned about, again, hurting our clients, which we should be concerned about, but there's so many other ways to engage and interact with press, not in the cases where it's just like, you know, here's this outlier case, what do you want to say about it? But in developing those relationships and educating journalists, a lot of on-background work. Some of the most powerful journalism that's come out over the last 5-10 years has come from either pitches, tips, education on background, where they're not even quoted at all, from public defenders. Last thing I'll say for now is that I think going back to, again, community. I think it is absolutely critical. Another big piece of what we work with defenders and defender offices on is really showing up right with community, thinking more collaboratively about what that looks like, and that includes with the folks they represent. So not treating community organizations just as service providers, but actually showing up and supporting them. Because what we find is when we speak out, and let's say, you know, there's understandable concern that, you know, something we might say might reflect, even if we say it right, reflect badly in the office or whatever. If there's ever that concern about independence, if you got community support behind you, it goes an extraordinarily long way. And I'll just say last but not least, I think I already said that once, but really last is that this is client-centered work, right? What we have seen with offices and defenders that have spoken out ethically, effectively, non-extractively, in a trauma-informed way, is that it yes, improves policies that have an impact on the folks we represent, and it impacts individual client representation because trust is improved, and morale within offices when folks are able to actually speak out about the systems that they see instead of just like going through the daily grind, morale gets boosted. So it's kind of client, it's client-centered from start to finish if done right.
Okay, Ansha?
So I think we win by turning our fight from criminal legal reform, which is certainly what I am here to do, to the issues and values that matter to the everyday person who isn't with us and doesn't start from a place of wanting justice reform. But what they do want, every single person wants, is safety and justice. And if that's where you start this conversation, whether that's across the kitchen table with your relative who disagrees or on social media or anywhere else, we will actually win in this conversation because we're talking about the common goal we all want.
Hannah?
Oh, okay, that's tough to follow up. All very good points. I want to give a bit of a specific answer so I'm based in the city of Atlanta, and this is taking off my Center for Just Journalism hat. I've been involved in the fight to stop Cop City, which is this proposed police militarization compound that's going to go into a forest. It's been very, very intersectionally opposed by folks in Atlanta for the better part of 2 years. And there has been like just an incredible narrative win from this movement. In a city, which, this is Atlanta specific, but I know it's not unique to Atlanta. The media ecosystem is very, very corporate. It has often not really reported on movements on the ground, but that's up until Cop City, folks were feeling like, okay, I have to go like send my pitch to this place that I know has a very, very clearly stated ethos that is antagonistic to what I want them to write. And to your point, Rabia, this movement succeeded because it was like, you know what, legacy media, I don't need you to tell this story. We're telling the story. We have already created this narrative. It's going to be so big that you have to cover it. And at that point, you have to cover it sort of on our terms. So, this sounds like an insignificant thing, but I think about the fact that when mainstream media started covering the movement, they started to call it Cop City instead of the public safety training facility. And that was a really hard fought.
I found this on the web for.
Oh, did other people hear that? Okay, I'm just going to keep going. So yeah, Cop City has a good sort of infrastructure for how you really tighten up this messaging on your own beforehand. There's no need to go to press whatsoever. And then it reaches this sort of zenith where mainstream media is like, okay, I do need to start covering this. And at that point, the first story that was out there was one that was framed by us, by the movement. And, I know that you all know this, but that first story has such a huge impact. That's sort of going to be what other folks build off of. Not because they're lazy or not able to do their own stories, but because, again, we have to be realistic about the constraints of these kinds of jobs. So, yeah, I think we win by having these incredibly inspirational, like tight messaging across the board that does not even attempt to go into the mainstream press until they are like, you know what, we have to come to you because this story is big enough that if we don't cover it, we're going to lose. So lots of examples of that, but definitely don't need to start by going to antagonistic newspapers that have not covered your issues well in the past.
And I would like to add that I think we win this by making the information accessible to everyday people. A lot of times, and in my work, and I think all of our work, we are talking to each other. We are talking to there's a lot of lawyers in the field. There are a lot of, just different types of people who are ingrained and steeped in this information and this knowledge every day. And the truth of the matter is, and I always say this, is like a lot of times we think we're competing with the next organization for coverage. Who we're competing with is the Beyonce concert. Who we're competing with is what happened with Taylor Swift last week, or whatever your interest that you spend your daily quality time when you're not thinking about work, or when you're not, whatever that is, that the pop culture, that is what we're battling against, trying to get a little space in someone's brain. And then also being able to make the information so accessible. Sometimes we talk about things, these topics and issues are things that people can get really easily. I mean, we have a different understanding because we can go into the nuance, we can go into the difference, just our different silos. But a lot of times what wins is, and I hate to say it, that whole phrase, do the crime, if you do the crime, you do the time. People, they took that and ran with it, right? So when you make it very, very simple for people, this is about actually keeping communities safe. What we had before doesn't work. All of that helps to pull and get the community behind you. And also, if you're hearing people on social media spread misinformation, go on there and tell them, hey, I think you should look at this. I actually don't, if you hear, especially a popular influencer, hit them up, say, hey, I heard you talk about this. I actually think it's this. Give them the information since they have the platform, instead of hoarding it within ourselves and being like, oh, they don't know what they're talking about. Try to educate them, and perhaps they can change the viewpoint of their audiences. So I think we have to start to look at this issue from a very, like, I don't want to say grassroots, but we do focus a lot on grass tops. And I'll say this, a lot of times we want that op-ed in the New York Times, but I'll say it again, if you put it in the shade room, more people will see it. I mean, I'm just giving that kind of just a position. Who are you trying to reach with this message? How can we change it? Really, it's through reaching actual people, because that's where the narrative changing happens to impact politicians and everything else. But I have a couple of questions from Angeline, actually. I've seen an increase in the number of stories in California about business leaving unhoused communities. What comes out of this? What comes out is the fear that Insha laid out. Are you in communication with California legislators, policymakers on their messaging, because the narrative of people and business leaving is intense?
I can start, and obviously please jump in, everybody else. Yes, we are. What we are doing is pushing back against conventional wisdom. And in California in particular, the narrative around San Francisco and Chesa Boudin's recall is kind of the only conversation that politicians want to have when it comes to issues of crime and how does this work in the electoral space. So we are pushing a boulder uphill. But if we keep pushing, if we keep talking and having those conversations sort of at the kitchen table level, eventually it will bubble up. I love Hannah's point that you don't go necessarily straight to the opposition. You start your messaging where you know it will have traction, and then eventually your opponents will come. I think that's right. We are spending 2023 doing local polling and election research to figure out for the candidates who won on the platforms that we believe in, like Brandon Johnson. There's other examples, Donna Deegan in Jacksonville, Florida, a number of others. Like, we're actually studying those elections to see why, right? Because I think what politicians need to see is there's enough people running on this platform where they are owning issues of safety and winning in order to be able to steer them in different ways. So this is generational work. That's like the 5, 10-year, 25-year plan, but we've got to be on it. And, you know, one thing I didn't say about Brandon Johnson that I should say, we did an election night exit survey of actual voters. And we asked them, who do you think is more credible on solving issues of crime and safety? And basically Brandon Johnson and Paul Vallis, his challenger, were neck and neck. It rarely happens when you ask that people think a Democrat or a progressive is as strong on safety as the Republican, again, because they don't talk about the issue as much. And with Brandon Johnson talking about it and talking about a policy platform that people believe in, that's what wins the day. And so we're working on it. I think in California, we've got to have some local wins. So fighting Pamela Price's recall is actually really important for the larger narrative there. And there's got to be local wins that help to say, actually, don't just look at Chesa Boudin. Here are all of these other examples that show we can win on this narrative.
Okay, we have 2 more, so I'm gonna try to get to both of them. But an anonymous attendee asked, how can politicians who feel the need to align themselves with law enforcement as a necessary part of campaigning be convinced of this evidence-based messaging as an effective alternative?
That's one great data point from our research, which is people see through police unions and they see them essentially as political players that don't have a whole lot of credibility. So in our local research, we have asked, like, how favorable do you view following institutions? One of them is police unions, and in each and every one, they rank well below the police, for one thing. And then they also rank below other people, like in the Philadelphia mayoral election. Larry Krasner was more favorably viewed by voters than either the police department, by a long shot, the police union. So I think we just need to start showing them data, being like, that endorsement that you covet so much does not matter. We have a memo coming out next week that actually has a list of police union endorsed candidates who lost this past year. It's longer than the police union endorsed candidates that won.
I think inches onto something substantial, which is that you give them evidence that it helps. So we kind of you show them that that we're there for them. And another way that we found has been really helpful is in some of our rapid response work, where we're actually providing rapid response facts when some of these stories about businesses fleeing or something being related to bail reform that happens when it's not really, letting legislators know that we got their backs. We got their backs with data and facts, and they can talk to their colleagues and they can also talk to their constituents. And so, yeah, just kind of arming, for lack of a better word, arming legislators with facts, with information, and making sure that they know that they're not out here on an island alone. Because this is, for politicians, very kind of new, scary, lonely feeling waters. And so the more that we can support them, I think the better.
This can be done by constituents too. I mean, if there is someone running for office, even if it's local office, like just initiating these meetings, like Scott said, letting them know that people have their back. It's very easy if they're just looking at, top line polling and watching cable news to think like, oh, I have no support for saying these things. Everybody in the city feels this way. So, I think it is also incumbent on folks doing this kind of work on the ground who, again, just know more and are in a position to share that, to do that like forward outreach to candidates to make sure that they understand that it's safe to do this.
Okay, last question. What is the strongest and most comprehensive data set that you found for effectively countering the narrative that reducing/eliminating pretrial detention causes an increase in crime?
I'm about to plug a Center for Just Journalism publication. This is, I'm putting it into the chat. So this speaks to 6 different jurisdictions reforms. It's very, very specific. As you all know, often this stuff is both incredibly locality specific, and also there is general truths that have been true for many, many decades, and we have many decades of data to show that. So the link that I just dropped is our sort of issue brief for journalists who are covering any kind of change to pretrial detention systems. I'm quite sure that there are other good things, but I had to plug that.
Okay, just do closing thoughts and then we can wrap up. So I'll start with Scott.
Going back to the dinner table conversations, I think one thing for all of us to think about is, instead of explaining, I've found something that's been successful for me is asking questions. Why do you think people got to the position of the point where they're using substances and they're unhoused? Like, what do you think, like, what does an arrest look like? What do you think happens after someone's arrested? I found that even some of the most hardened, so to speak, like San Franciscans, have been more receptive as you walk them through, and they put more logic to the answers themselves rather than being explained to. Just put that out there for all y'all.
Hannah?
Yeah, kind of dovetailing off of that. Just share the information that you have. I am willing to bet that everyone on this call has specific knowledge that some journalist out there would really benefit from knowing. Again, I understand deeply the fears about speaking on the record and, all of the things that are scary about speaking with press, but the reality is this stuff gets written about whether or not we have a say in sort of the coverage. And I think it's very, very important that we do have that say. So yeah, I would just encourage folks to make relationships, two-way to the extent that you're able to with reporters. Again, to Scott's point, help them think about how to expand what public safety means. So, yes, important to report on this burglary, I guess, but let's also think about like the OSHA violations in your city in 2023, or, wage theft, all of these things that we know have as much, if not more, of impact on public safety than sort of index crimes. So just slow relationship-based work, political education with reporters. Yeah, I would just encourage that.
Sure.
So I began my legal career as a public defender, and in court, I remember just often sort of wanting to duck the question of safety or feel like I'm on the defense when I'm representing somebody, especially somebody charged with something serious. And what I know from this messaging research we've done from the last year is we are right on safety. And the thing that people want is to prevent crime before it happens and not just react after. And people actually understand that there are root causes and drivers, and they are far more empathetic when they hear about them. So if I could go back and 10 years earlier tell my public defender self to not be afraid and to own the issue of safety, whether that's in the courtroom or at the kitchen table talking to my family or anywhere else in my advocacy, I would be a more effective advocate for it. And I think that's true for all of us.
And I'll give my closing thoughts and then we can give you back the rest of your time. My biggest thing is that we need to talk more, not less. And we need to question why we decide not to speak up. And I think a lot of the time, I come to this work as a purely communications professional. I have never been a lawyer. I have never been any of these things. And I have seen and I have noticed that we use the same reasoning that we used 20 years ago as to why we can't do something today. Times have changed. We must speak up. We must speak out. This is not we're not going to tank ourselves and our lives or whatever it may be. And we need to really, really dig deep and question and also use the tools that everyone else uses. Social media, writing blogs. If you are a trial attorney and you're really great at speaking, YouTube videos, I mean, like we have the power to literally change things. And I think that we need to be less fearful of what could happen and think more about what could be. How can we make a difference? How can we switch this around? Because I can tell you that a lot of the people on the other side are not talking to everyday people anymore. They're using and relying on the same old stuff, and it's just going unchecked, as we've all talked about before. So be brave, start to message more, test more messages, work with Scott, work with Hannah, work with Inja, work with me, and we can all figure out how to really turn the tide on this narrative. And with that, you have your time.
Thank you so much. And before we close out day 2, I just want to thank our panelists, Hannah and Jen, Scott and Rabia, for just joining and sharing the information, and definitely a wealth of information. A lot of there is a sort of materials page for the conference. And so you'll find a lot of the links that were shared in the chat will appear there as well. And we will update it after the conference so that we are getting and reflecting some of the things that have come up in terms of the resources, and so that you can have that as a reference to go back when you are re-listening to these sessions. What goes to show these sessions are being recorded. If you've registered for the conference, which I think everyone has, you will get notified when those recordings are made publicly available on our website. So again, I want to thank this panel and then thank everyone in the audience for joining us and sticking with us for this 2-day conference. So thank you so much.